August 1944. The night sky above the Japanese islands was unnaturally still. Cicadas sang across rice paddies. Lanterns flickered behind paper walls. Then, somewhere beyond the horizon, came a faint, unfamiliar hum. Low, steady, metallic. It grew louder. A deep drone that rolled across the sky like distant thunder. Children looked up. Old men paused in the streets. Housewives clutched their sleeves and stared toward the sea. Soon, black silhouettes appeared against the moonlit clouds, vast four-engine bombers gliding high above any gun's reach. Each one a fortress of aluminum, carrying tons of destruction within. The people had never seen machines like these. No Zero, no anti-aircraft gun could touch them. They flew too high, too far, too long. The sound of their engines echoed for minutes even after the formation vanished. From that night on, Japan understood. The sky no longer belonged to them. It belonged to America, and to the B-29 superfortress. The question now was how this distant empire had built such dominance in the air. By mid-1944, the Pacific War had entered its most decisive phase. Japan's empire, once stretching from Burma to the Solomon Islands, was crumbling piece by piece. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been shattered in the battles of the Philippine Sea and Midway, its proud carrier fleet reduced to ruins. Yet Japan itself, the homeland, remained largely untouched. No foreign soldier had set foot upon its soil. The people believed that the sacred islands would never be reached. But across the ocean, in the industrial heart of the United States, a silent revolution had been unfolding. In factories spread across Kansas, Washington, and Georgia, tens of thousands of men and women worked around the clock to produce the most advanced bomber the world had ever seen, the Boeing B-29 superfortress. It was unlike any aircraft before it. Pressurized cabins allowed crews to fly above 30,000 feet. Remote-controlled gun turrets defended it from all directions. It could carry over 20,000 pounds of bombs and cross more than 3,000 miles without refueling. In every way, it represented the full industrial and technological might of America. A machine born not just of metal, but of strategy and necessity. The U.S. Army Air Forces under General Henry Hap Arnold envisioned the B-29 as the weapon that could strike Japan directly from distant bases. First from China, then from the newly captured islands in the Pacific. It would end Japan's ability to fight by burning its war industries, its transport systems, and its very cities to ash. For Japanese civilians, the war had so far felt distant. They had sent sons, brothers, and fathers to far-off battlefields, but life on the islands continued. Rationed, yes, but largely untouched. Cities glowed at night. Schools operated. Propaganda told them victory was assured. Then came the first warnings. In June 1944, radar operators in Kyushu picked up unknown blips high above their coverage range. Moments later, distant booms echoed over Yawata, an industrial city known for its steelworks. Japan's anti-aircraft gunners fired wildly into the clouds, but the intruders, flying higher than any interceptor could reach, vanished into the night sky. Below, the first B-29 raid on Japan had begun. The Yawata raid was small, fewer than 100 aircraft from bases in Chengdu, China, but it marked a new age in warfare. For the first time, Japanese civilians saw American bombers flying directly over their homeland. Newspapers reported enemy planes of unknown type and urged calm. But the people could sense a shift. In the months that followed, more raids came, sporadic, limited by logistics and the impossible supply lines through China. Yet every time the bombers appeared, they sowed fear far greater than the physical damage they caused. The engine's deep, constant hum became a psychological weapon. From farmers in Kyushu to clerks in Tokyo, people began to whisper of the new bombers, machines that flew where no Japanese plane could follow. They seemed invincible, untouchable, and endless. Behind the scenes, Japan's military leaders scrambled for answers. The Mitsubishi Raiden, the Kai-44 Tojo, and the new Nakajima Ki-84 Frank fighters were rushed into service, but even these high-altitude interceptors struggled to reach the B-29's cruising level. Anti-aircraft fire burst far below the bombers' paths, useless against the American formations cruising serenely above the clouds. By late 1944, one truth had become clear to every general and every civilian who listened to the sky. Japan's defenses were no longer enough. The Americans had found a way to strike directly at the heart of the empire, and nothing could stop them. And yet, this was only the beginning, because on the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, new airfields were rising from the coral and ash. From these islands, the B-29s would soon take off not from distant China, but from American-controlled soil just 1,500 miles from Tokyo itself. That was when the real storm would begin. The construction of the Marianas airfields was one of the most extraordinary engineering efforts of the Second World War. When U.S. Marines stormed Saipan in June 1944, followed by Tinian and Guam, they fought not only Japanese soldiers but the geography itself. Dense jungles, volcanic terrain, and coral reefs that sliced through landing craft. The battle for Saipan alone cost over 3,400 American lives and tens of thousands of Japanese dead, many of them civilians who leapt from the island's cliffs rather than surrender. Yet even as the fighting raged, engineers of the U.S. Navy's Seabees were already planning runways long enough to handle the enormous B-29s. Within weeks of capturing each island, construction teams began leveling the coral and pouring miles of crushed limestone. On Tinian, a small island barely 12 miles long, they built the largest airfield complex in the world, Northfield, with 4 parallel runways, fuel depots, and maintenance hangars capable of hosting hundreds of bombers. From these airfields, the sky war against Japan would begin in earnest. In November 1944, the first missions launched from the Marianas. The 73rd Bomb Wing under General Haywood Hansell took off into the darkness, engines roaring across the Pacific night. Their destination, Tokyo. For the Japanese people, it was a night that would erase every illusion of safety. Sirens wailed. Searchlights swept the clouds. Anti-aircraft shells burst blindly against the black sky. Yet the bombers kept coming, vast formations of silver giants, their engines vibrating through the night. From below, they looked like slow-moving stars, their contrails glowing faintly in the moonlight. The early raids were high-altitude attacks aimed at Japan's industrial infrastructure. Aircraft plants, steelworks, shipyards. But results were disappointing. The jet stream winds over Japan scattered bomb patterns. Bombs dropped from 30,000 feet drifted miles off target. American airmen returned home frustrated, and many aircraft were lost to mechanical failures and the sheer length of the missions. Still, each raid left a mark deeper than statistics could measure. For civilians on the ground, the experience was terrifying. The sound of the B-29s filled the night for hours, a slow, pulsing vibration that made the walls tremble and the heart freeze. There was no warning, no visible enemy, only the promise that somewhere above the clouds, destruction was waiting. Propaganda called them the new American fortresses. Rumors spread of planes immune to bullets, of invisible bombers that came and went like ghosts. For those who survived each raid, there was a growing realization that Japan, an island nation that once prided itself on control of the skies, could no longer protect even its own cities. The Imperial General Headquarters attempted to downplay the damage, but the government could not silence the sound that haunted the nights. B-29s did not just bomb cities, they shattered morale. The notion of an untouchable homeland began to crumble. By early 1945, command of the UDOM Bomber Command shifted to Major General Curtis E. LeMay, a man whose cold precision and ruthless efficiency would redefine the American bombing campaign. LeMay studied the weather patterns, aircraft limitations, and target failures of previous missions. Then he made a decision that would change everything. Drop the altitude, change the bombs, and strike Japan's wooden cities with fire instead of steel. The weapon, the M69 incendiary cluster bomb, designed to ignite on impact and spread streams of burning napalm across rooftops and streets. The strategy, nighttime. Low-level area bombing to destroy urban centers built largely from wood and paper. In March 1945, the first of these new raids began, and Tokyo burned. For the first time, the Japanese people witnessed entire districts vanish overnight. The once confident empire that had marched triumphantly across Asia now watched as its own cities were erased by fire from the sky. The deep drone of the B-29s became more than a sound. It became a signal, a warning that the world had changed. What had started as a symbol of technological mastery was now a tool of total war. The American airmen, too, faced moral weight with every mission, knowing that below their bomb bays lay hundreds of thousands of civilians. But the mission continued. The order was clear: end the war by any means necessary. And so, night after night, the sky above Japan belonged not to the rising sun, but to the silver wings of the super fortress. The stage was set for the most devastating air campaign in human history, one that would turn entire cities into ash before forcing Japan to confront the unimaginable. The story of the B-29 campaign over Japan is not just about machines and targets. It is about perspectives. Every sound of those engines meant something different, depending on who heard it. To the Americans in the air, it was the thrum of power, technology, and purpose. To the Japanese on the ground, it was the sound of inevitability, of war reaching their very doorsteps. Let us look through several angles that together reveal the full scope of this transformation in warfare. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was the single most advanced aircraft of the Second World War. Each one cost more than $1 million, a staggering sum for its time, and required 60,000 engineering drawings to design. It was built not for tactical battles, but for strategic domination. Its Wright R-33 5D duplex Cyclone engines were both a marvel and a menace, powerful enough to carry the bomber above 30,000 feet, yet so complex they often overheated and caught fire during early missions. Pressurized compartments allowed crews to breathe comfortably in the thin air, while remote-controlled gun turrets gave the plane a 360-degree defense network guided by analog computers, a concept decades ahead of its time. For Japan's defenders, this was an aircraft from another world. Their best interceptors could barely climb to the B-29's altitude, and even when they did, their guns lacked the range to inflict serious damage. The Americans called their mission strategic bombardment. The Japanese called the bombers Hiryuki Bakudan, the flying dragons. Every aspect of the B-29 symbolized American industrial might, from the aluminum skin polish to mirror-like shine, to the navigation systems that linked radar, celestial observation, and radio direction. It was technology transformed into a weapon of precision and endurance. But technology alone did not decide wars. The next angle reveals what it felt like to be human inside those silver giants. For the American crews, each mission was a test of endurance and nerve. A typical bombing run from the Marianas to Tokyo lasted 14 to 16 hours, 3,000 miles round trip. The men flew through sub-zero temperatures, turbulence, and sometimes engine fires, all while knowing that a single mechanical failure could leave them adrift over the Pacific. Inside the pressurized fuselage, the air was dry and cold. Oxygen masks left red marks on faces. The intercom crackled with static as pilots, bombardiers, and gunners communicated in short bursts. The smell of oil and metal mixed with the faint tang of fear. They were young, most barely in their 20s, but they carried the weight of entire cities in their bomb bays. For many, the moral struggle was silent but constant. They knew their targets were not soldiers or tanks, but factories and neighborhoods. Yet they believed, as their commanders told them, that every bomb dropped brought the war closer to ending. Diaries from the crews often reflected this conflict. One gunner wrote, "Tokyo looked peaceful from up here. Lights from fires blinked like campfires. You could almost forget what it meant." Another simply noted, "We are burning a city tonight." The B-29s were called super fortresses, but inside, they were human spaces, cramped, noisy, and filled with a strange mix of duty and dread. Each mission left the men more aware of the power they carried and the price that power demanded. For Japanese civilians, the arrival of the B-29s was a descent into terror. The old rhythm of life, morning markets, factory whistles, evening trains, gave way to nights of alarms and sleepless waiting. Cities like Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe began organizing volunteer fire brigades. Buckets of water stood beside every doorway. School children practiced evacuation drills. But nothing could prepare them for what came when the bombers appeared overhead. The first sound was always the same, a deep, droning hum that built slowly until it filled the air. The ground seemed to vibrate. Mothers gathered their children, clutching small bundles of belongings. Elderly men helped neighbors dig shallow trenches. Dogs howled in panic. Then, in the distance, came the thuds. Slow at first, then a rolling thunder of explosions that merged into one endless roar. Firestorms consumed neighborhoods in minutes. The heat melted asphalt and glass. Wooden homes ignited like dry straw. Survivors recalled winds so hot and fast that people were lifted from the ground. Entire families vanished in moments. After each raid, silence returned, a silence heavy with disbelief. People picked through ashes searching for relatives or simply stared at the horizon, waiting for the next drone to return. To them, the B-29 was not a machine. It was a sound, a shadow, a promise of death from a sky once thought divine. Leadership shaped how the B-29 campaign evolved and how the war's moral boundaries shifted. General Haywood Hansell, the first commander of the WW2 Bomber Command, believed in precision. His goal was to cripple Japan's war production with minimal civilian casualties. He ordered high-altitude, daylight raids aimed strictly at factories, steel plants, and docks. But the results were poor, and Washington grew impatient. Then came Curtis LeMay. His approach was brutally pragmatic. To him, war was not about precision, it was about results. He stripped the bombers of their defensive guns to reduce weight, lowered their altitude to just 5,000 to 7,000 feet, and replaced explosive ordnance with napalm-filled incendiaries. The missions would be at night against entire cities. The change worked, tactically, devastatingly. In a single raid on Tokyo on March 9–10, 1945, nearly 100,000 people were killed and a quarter of the city destroyed. LeMay later said, "If we lose the war, we'll be tried as war criminals." He knew the cost of his decisions and made them anyway. Under LeMay's command, the B-29 became a tool not just of strategy, but of total psychological and industrial annihilation. The roar of the superfortress engines echoed across two worlds. One in the air, believing they were ending the war. The other on the ground, believing the world itself was ending. And yet, there were still other sides to this story, the tactical innovations, the moral reckonings, and the unseen consequences that would shape post-war Japan and the future of aerial warfare itself. The B-29 campaign was a web of contradictions, a fusion of progress and destruction, morality and necessity, victory and guilt. To complete this picture, we must explore the remaining perspectives that defined how this war in the air transformed not only nations, but the very idea of modern warfare. The doctrine behind the B-29 campaign was born long before the first mission ever took off. American military planners believed that if a nation's industrial heart was destroyed, its will to fight would collapse. This theory, strategic bombing, had been tested in Europe, but never on an enemy so geographically isolated as Japan. The challenge was immense. Japan's cities were far across the Pacific, surrounded by thousands of miles of open ocean. Supply lines stretched thin. Each sortie required complex coordination between weather teams, navigators, and mechanics. Even a small error in wind prediction could send bombs miles off course. At first, U.S. forces targeted military facilities and aircraft plants. But the Japanese war industry was deeply embedded within civilian areas. Small workshops producing aircraft parts operated from homes, schools, and shrines. Precision became impossible. LeMay's low-altitude raids, though controversial, solved one tactical problem: accuracy. At 5,000 feet, bombs hit their targets directly, and the M69 incendiary clusters multiplied destruction exponentially. The strategy shifted from dismantling Japan's war machine to dismantling the very infrastructure that sustained it: water, transport, housing, and morale. It worked. In just 5 months, the American bombers destroyed 40% of Japan's urban area. Railways collapsed, power grids failed, and food distribution stopped in several regions. Japan's cities became silent shells of ash. Yet tactically successful did not mean morally clear. The deeper question remained: how far could a nation go to end a war? Few moments in the war forced such profound reflection as the firebombing of Tokyo. In the early hours of March 10, 1945, more than 300 B-29s approached the city from multiple directions. They flew low, their silhouettes glinting against the sea. At 1 a.m., the first incendiaries fell over the densely packed wards of eastern Tokyo. In minutes, a wall of flame spread across miles of wooden homes. Wind speeds rose to 100 miles per hour. People suffocated in shelters as the oxygen burned away. Pilots reported seeing a red ocean below, waves of fire sweeping through the capital. The raid killed an estimated 100,000 civilians, more than Hiroshima. More than Nagasaki. From a distance, it was seen as success. Japan's war production plummeted, and morale cracked. Up close, it was horror. American commanders knew the scale of what they had done. LeMay later admitted, "Killing Japanese didn't bother me very much at that time. I suppose if I'd lost the war, I would have been tried as a war criminal." For Japanese survivors, there was no political language for what they endured. Many described the fire as a living creature, roaring, feeding, consuming everything. The smell of burning bamboo mixed with that of human flesh. Whole families vanished without trace, leaving only melted coins or scorched sandals. Historians would later debate whether these attacks shortened the war or simply crossed a moral line that could never be uncrossed. But in 1945, there was no time for philosophy. The war's logic had become self-fulfilling. Every bomb dropped promised peace, if only one more city burned. Long before the bombs fell, the B-29s had already conquered Japan's spirit. Survivors often said the sound of the bombers was worse than the explosions themselves. A low, endless vibration that filled the sky like a heartbeat of doom. That sound became the new rhythm of life. Children in Tokyo could identify the B-29 drone before seeing them. Families in Nagoya learned to count seconds between sirens and detonations. Even in remote villages untouched by bombing, people watched the contrails streak the heavens and whispered prayers. The imperial government censored reports of devastation, but rumors spread faster than official statements. Refugees carried stories of entire cities erased in one night. The B-29 became a myth as much as a machine, a symbol of inevitable defeat. By mid-1945, psychological exhaustion had spread through the population. Civilians dug shelters they knew would not save them. Air raid drills became routine, but participation waned. Many simply stared upward when sirens wailed, accepting fate. The sound of the B-29 was no longer just mechanical. It was the sound of surrender approaching, a mechanical requiem that echoed the collapse of an empire. Inside Japan's military command, frustration turned to despair. The Japanese Air Defense General Headquarters, led by General Hideki Tojo until his resignation, had promised that the homeland would remain secure. But the reality was grim. Radar coverage was weak, fuel supplies were depleted, and most experienced pilots had been lost in earlier battles. The remaining interceptors, Kai-84, Franks, Kai-61 Tonys, and J-2M Raidens, climbed desperately toward the bombers, but their engines failed in the thin air. Pilots described shooting at shadows, their bullets disappearing into the dark. Japan began using desperate measures. Ramming attacks by fighter pilots, Tayatari missions, it became common. Young men were ordered to sacrifice themselves by colliding directly with the B-29s. In one tragic report, a pilot's final words were, "Tell my mother I hit one." Yet for every bomber lost, 10 more arrived the next night. The Americans replaced losses effortlessly. Japan could not. Commanders pleaded for a miracle, a new weapon, a new defense, anything. None came. The empire had built its war machine on spirit and sacrifice, but now faced an enemy built on steel, fuel, and factories that never slept. The defense of the homeland became symbolic, not strategic. The B-29s owned the sky. By the summer of 1945, Japan was burning city by city: Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Yokohama, Kobe, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. Each raid brought the empire closer to collapse, yet surrender remained unspoken. And so, as August approached, America prepared to deliver the final, irreversible blow. A strike that would not just burn a city, but redefine warfare itself. August 6, 1945. The morning over Hiroshima began like any other. The air was warm, the sky perfectly clear. Streetcars rattled along the tracks. Office clerks walked to work in pressed uniforms. Housewives hung laundry on balconies overlooking the quiet Motoyasu River. At 7:09 a.m., the air raid siren sounded, but when spotters saw only a few high-altitude aircraft, the all-clear was given minutes later. To the people below, it was just another day under the uneasy hum of war. Then, at 8:15 a.m., the world changed. A lone B-29, Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, released a single bomb from 31,000 feet. It fell for 43 seconds. The explosion that followed was unlike anything in human history. A blinding flash illuminated the city. Temperatures at ground zero soared above 4,000 degrees. Buildings vaporized. Shadows of people were seared into stone walls. Within seconds, Hiroshima ceased to exist as a functioning city. The bomb's name was Little Boy. It was the first atomic weapon used in war. From the air, the crew saw a rising column of fire and dust, a mushroom cloud stretching into the stratosphere. "My God," one whispered. "What have we done?" Below, the blast wave tore through homes, hospitals, and schools. Over 70,000 people died instantly. Tens of thousands more would succumb in the days and weeks ahead, burned, buried, or poisoned by invisible radiation. Yet to those in Tokyo, news of the destruction arrived slowly, almost incomprehensibly. Military communications failed. Reports spoke of a new type of bomb that had annihilated the entire city. Even the most hardened commanders struggled to believe it. But in Washington and on Tinian, where the Enola Gay had taken off, the reaction was measured. The B-29 had done what it was designed to do, project American power to the heart of Japan. The mission's success confirmed what General Curtis LeMay and his superiors already knew. Air power alone could force surrender. Still, the Japanese government refused to yield. Emperor Hirohito and his war council debated in silence, unwilling to face what surrender would mean: the end of the divine empire, the humiliation of unconditional defeat. 3 days later, the Americans acted again. On August 9, 1945, another B-29, Boxcar, piloted by Major Charles Sweeney, carried a second atomic bomb, Fat Man, intended for Kokura. But heavy clouds and smoke from previous raids obscured the city. The bomber turned to its secondary target, Nagasaki, at 11:02 a.m., the bomb fell. The explosion was even more powerful than Hiroshima's, though the city's valleys and hills confined the destruction. Within moments, 40,000 were dead. The survivors spoke of a light brighter than 1,000 suns. By evening, 2 cities had vanished. The empire that had once ruled half of Asia was now facing extinction. The Japanese cabinet met in emergency session that night. Army generals demanded continued resistance, promising to defend the homeland in a final, suicidal battle. Navy officers admitted it was hopeless. Food was running out. Cities were gone. Industry was dust. The B-29 still circled above, endless, untouchable, eternal. Then came the emperor's voice, the one no ordinary Japanese citizen had ever heard. Hirohito chose to end the war. But before the formal announcement, the Americans prepared one final mission. On August 14, 1945, 1,000 B-29s took to the air in the largest raid of the Pacific War. They bombed targets across northern Honshu and Hokkaido, while others dropped leaflets declaring the war was over. For civilians below, the contradiction was unbearable, bombs falling from the sky and messages telling them to stop fighting. Yet it was clear, Japan could not survive another dawn like this. That night, Emperor Hirohito recorded a message to his people. The following day, it was broadcast nationwide. His voice, calm and distant, told the nation that the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, and that they must endure the unendurable. For the first time in history, the rising sun set without victory. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. The B-29s no longer roamed the skies. Their engines, once the voice of destruction, now fell silent over a nation in ruins. But the victory that silenced them carried questions that would echo for generations. About power, morality, and the new world their shadows had created, because the end of bombing did not mean the end of consequence, only marked the beginning of understanding what had truly happened in those final months of the war, when the fires went out and the bombs stopped falling. Japan stood in a silence that felt almost unreal. The cities were flattened. The sky that once thundered with the sound of engines was now still, hazed by drifting smoke. Yet amid the ruins, the echoes of the B-29 campaign remained, in memory, in ash, and in the shape of a new world forming from the old. The B-29 had done what no navy or army could. It had forced an empire to its knees without invasion. But victory carried a cost that was not easily measured in numbers. Even as atomic fire consumed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, conventional bombing continued. The last large-scale effort of the war, Operation Starvation, targeted Japan's lifelines instead of its cities. Starting in March 1945, the B-29s dropped thousands of naval mines into the shallow waters of Japan's harbors and coastal routes. The results were catastrophic. Merchant ships sank faster than they could be replaced. Rice, coal, and raw materials never reached their destinations. Starvation spread across the islands, not by direct violence, but by suffocation of supply. By July, 80% of Japan's shipping had been destroyed. Millions faced hunger as the harvest failed and imports ceased. The mines, silent and unseen, were as deadly as any bomb. The B-29 campaign had moved beyond destruction. It was now erasing Japan's ability to live. By the summer of 1945, the Japanese High Command had no illusions left. The air defense network was in fragments. The once glorious Imperial Navy lay rusting in ports, its fuel reserves exhausted. Even the most loyal officers whispered the unthinkable, that surrender might be the only path to survival. For the people, exhaustion became a kind of numbness. Cities no longer had names, only descriptions. The one that burned, the one still standing. Families scattered to the countryside, where food was slightly more plentiful, but even there, they lived in fear of the sky. Children learned to distinguish between the drone of single-engine scouts and the heavy thrum of the B-29s. Each sound carried meaning, sometimes warning, sometimes dread. In Tokyo, government officials emerged from underground bunkers to see what remained, a city reduced to flattened blocks, with temples and train stations standing like ghosts among the ashes. When Emperor Hirohito finally spoke, many citizens wept not only for defeat but for relief. The endless noise, the sleepless nights, the running, the hiding, it was finally over. But as they listened to the faint crackle of his voice on the radio, one sound was missing. The engines. For the first time in nearly a year, Japan heard silence. For the Allied forces, the victory in the Pacific symbolized the beginning of a new age. The B-29 had demonstrated that wars could be won from the air. That distance was no longer protection, and that technology had surpassed human limitation. But beneath the triumph lay reflection. Many airmen, upon visiting the ruins after the surrender, felt a weight they had not expected. They saw the melted bridges, the burned schools, the children with bandaged eyes, and they realized the human scale of what those bomb bays had delivered. One pilot wrote in his journal, "We thought we were destroying machines. What we destroyed were lives that had never seen our faces." For Japanese survivors, the sound of engines became a memory they could never escape. Even years later, many would freeze at the rumble of passing aircraft. It was not just fear. It was recognition of a moment when the sky itself had turned against them. The B-29, once an icon of destruction, would soon become a symbol of peace in a strange twist of history. The same planes that had bombed Japan began flying humanitarian missions, dropping food, medicine, and supplies to starving civilians. Pilots who had once delivered fire now delivered hope. When American forces landed in Japan after the surrender, they found a population dazed but obedient. MacArthur's occupation government moved swiftly to demilitarize the nation, rebuild its economy, and reshape its society. But nothing symbolized the change more than the empty skies. The Japanese people had lived a year beneath the roar of engines. Now, the silence was almost unsettling. Factories lay abandoned, rail lines twisted, harbors clogged with sunken ships. Yet, amid the devastation, something new began to emerge. The first sparks of reconstruction. American engineers, some of whom had built the B-29s themselves, now worked side by side with Japanese laborers to rebuild infrastructure. The same industrial science that had produced bombers now fueled recovery. From that silence rose a new Japan, one that would, within a generation, rebuild itself into an industrial powerhouse, guided by the very technology that had once destroyed it. The war in the Pacific had ended, but the world it left behind was changed forever. No longer would geography protect nations. No longer would armies alone decide wars. From the night the first Japanese civilians heard the low drone over Kyushu, the nature of warfare and of humanity had shifted. The B-29 had proven that victory could come from the sky, but it had also shown that the power to destroy carried within it a warning that one day the same sky could bring an even greater silence. The war was over. The engine stopped, yet the consequences of the B-29 campaign lingered in every corner of Japan, from the smoking ruins of Tokyo to the silent fishing villages along the coast. When Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled across the airwaves on August 15, 1945, many citizens fell to their knees, unable to comprehend that the divine nation had surrendered. For months they had endured the thunder of the B-29s, the endless raids, the firestorms, the hunger. And now, all at once, the sound was gone. The silence was heavier than the noise had ever been. The full scale of the destruction took weeks to understand. Tokyo had lost nearly half of its buildings. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, each city reduced to grids of ash and twisted steel. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, erased in an instant, became names that would forever echo the price of air power. In total, an estimated 330,000 Japanese civilians were killed by the strategic bombing campaign, with millions more left homeless. The burned-out skeletons of homes stretched for miles, and the smell of soot lingered long after the fires had cooled. Entire districts vanished, neighborhoods that had existed for centuries wiped out in one night. Yet amid the devastation, life persisted. Survivors dug through debris for keepsakes, rebuilt makeshift huts, and shared what little food they had. Many Japanese later said that they had learned to live in the ruins. In the United States, the B-29 campaign was celebrated as the pinnacle of military achievement. It had represented the triumph of American industry and innovation, a symbol of how technology could shorten wars and save lives on the ground. General Curtis LeMay, who had orchestrated the firebombing strategy, famously remarked that had the U.S. lost the war, he and others might have been tried as war criminals. Was an admission both of success and of moral uncertainty, for even the victors knew what had been unleashed. For the engineers and pilots who had served in the B-29 program, the sense of accomplishment was tempered by reflection. The aircraft had achieved everything it was designed to do: fly farther, higher, faster, and deliver devastation beyond anything seen before. But many began to question whether victory at such a cost truly represented progress. In interviews years later, some airmen recalled watching the glow of burning cities from 30,000 feet and realizing that beneath those clouds of fire were people, mothers, children, entire families. That awareness would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In the ruins of Japan, the struggle to survive became the new battle. With transportation networks destroyed and food supplies cut off, starvation loomed over millions. The winter of 1945 was one of the coldest on record. Families huddled in bomb shelters now turned into homes, patching walls with scrap metal, burning broken furniture to stay warm. Diseases spread through crowded refugee camps. Rice became scarce. Sweet potatoes and barley became staples. Children scavenged for tin, nails, and wood, anything that could be traded for food. Yet amidst all this suffering, the seeds of resilience began to sprout. Teachers gathered surviving students in open fields to continue lessons. Farmers returned to their land, tilling soil still black with ash. And slowly, under the supervision of the Allied occupation, Japan began to rebuild not just its cities but its identity. When General Douglas MacArthur arrived in Tokyo as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, his mission was unprecedented: to transform a defeated empire into a peaceful democracy. Under his administration, Japan underwent a complete social and political reconstruction. The military was disbanded. The constitution was rewritten. Women were granted the right to vote. Factories once producing bombers and tanks were repurposed to build cars, radios, and eventually the technologies that would define post-war Japan. American air bases remained across the islands, and the sound of aircraft, once a symbol of fear, now represented security and alliance. But the memory of those B-29 drones never truly left. To the Japanese, they remained the sound of power beyond comprehension, a reminder that technology could both destroy and rebuild, depending on the hands that controlled it. As the first blossoms of spring 1946 appeared among the ruins, Japan stood at a crossroads, broken, humbled, but alive. The same skies that once rained fire now carried the promise of renewal, and from the ashes of war, a new world began to take shape. When the last American bombers left the Pacific, Japan was no longer the empire that had entered the war in 1941. It was a nation of survivors. Its people had endured the unimaginable, and from that endurance, a new identity was born. In the late 1940s, under Allied supervision, Japan began rebuilding its economy from the ground up. Factories once dedicated to producing Zero fighters and warships were converted into facilities for household goods and machinery. The same meticulous craftsmanship that had built warplanes was now directed toward peace. the United States. Recognizing Japan's potential as a stabilizing force in post-war Asia, introduced the Dodge Plan and Marshall-style aid, providing vital economic support and opening trade opportunities. Within a decade, Japanese industry was reborn. By the mid-1950s, Japan's cities were humming again, not with the sound of bombers, but with the buzz of factories, radios, and trains. The transformation was astonishing. A country once left in ruins by aerial dominance had harnessed the very concept of technological power to rebuild itself. The B-29, which had symbolized destruction, had indirectly laid the foundation for Japan's modernization. For decades after the war, Japan struggled with how to remember the air raids. The atomic bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki overshadowed the fire bombings. Even though the conventional raids had killed far more people overall, cities built memorials and museums. But for many survivors, known as hibakusha of the air raids, the memories remained deeply personal and often unspoken. They remembered the sound of engines before dawn. They remembered the heat, the smell, the desperate scramble toward rivers that had already boiled from the fire. Many could never again look at the sky the same way. In America, too, there was reflection. The pilots and crew of the B-29s became part of military legend, their missions studied and commemorated. But beneath the pride, there was an enduring question. Had humanity crossed a line that could never be uncrossed? Historians and ethicists still debate the morality of the firebombing campaign, whether it was a strategic necessity or an act of terror. Even Curtis LeMay himself later admitted, "Killing Japanese didn't bother me very much at that time. I suppose if I had lost the war, I would have been tried as a war criminal." That confession revealed the paradox of modern warfare, the point where technological progress and moral consequence collide. The B-29 program reshaped the very nature of global warfare. Its success proved that industrial strength and aerial reach could determine the fate of nations. Its wake came the jet age, guided missiles, and the dawn of nuclear deterrence. The bomber became not just a weapon, but a philosophy, the belief that control of the sky equaled control of destiny. For Japan, that belief took a different form. Instead of building fleets of warplanes, the post-war nation invested in science, education, and precision technology. Its mastery of engineering, born from wartime necessity, evolved into innovation that would lead the world in electronics, automobiles, and robotics. In a tragic irony, the same culture of perfection that once built bombers for war would later build machines for peace, ones that would carry Japan into a new century. Even today, when elderly survivors of the bombings hear the distant hum of aircraft, some still pause and look to the sky. For them, the sound is a bridge to a night long ago, when the air itself roared and the horizon glowed red. In museums across Tokyo and Hiroshima, fragments of B-29 wreckage are displayed beside charred household items and children's toys. Each piece tells a story of power and fragility, of nations and individuals, of how easily progress can become destruction. The B-29's legacy is not confined to history books or documentaries. It lives in every debate about air warfare, every discussion of civilian cost, every attempt to balance strategy with humanity. The planes are gone, but their echo remains, a deep, distant drone that still reminds the world who once ruled the skies. The aftermath of the B-29 campaign was not merely an end. It was a beginning, a lesson written in fire and rebuilt in peace. Japan's skies, once owned by the enemy, would one day be filled again, this time not with bombers, but with the dreams of a nation reborn. In the quiet years that followed the war, Japan looked up at the same sky that had once burned with fire and ash. The clouds drifted the same way. The sun rose over the same islands, yet everything beneath it had changed. The drone of the B-29 had been more than the sound of engines. It was the sound of a turning point in human history, It marked the moment when distance no longer meant safety, when the boundaries between battlefield and home dissolved, and when technology gained the power to decide the fate of nations from thousands of miles away. The Japanese civilians who once stood beneath those bombers had witnessed the dawn of a new era, one where humanity's greatest creations could either save or destroy the world. And in that realization, a quiet truth emerged, that progress without conscience leads only to ruin. Yet, from that ruin, Japan rose. Not through vengeance, but through resilience. Not through war, but through work. The same hands that had built weapons now built machines of peace, cameras, cars, and circuits that would connect the modern world. The roar that once symbolized fear was replaced by the hum of industry, of trains, of city lights returning. The sky once owned by America became a shared sky again, open, limitless, and filled not with bombers but with hope. For those who remember, the memory of the B-29s is not only a scar, it is a warning that every sound of power carries with it the weight of responsibility, that the mastery of the air or of any technology must always serve humanity, not destroy it. The Japanese civilians who heard the B-29 drones that night did not know it then, but they were standing at the edge of the modern world, a world forever, shaped by what happened when man learned to rule the sky. The sound faded long ago, but its meaning and that fragile line between creation and destruction still echoes softly in every sky since.